So firstly, welcome everybody to today's Legumes for Development project webinar on the topic of scaling legume seed systems in East and Southern Africa. You're all very welcome. We're delighted to have our speaker, Noel Ndlovu, from the project. Noel is a PhD researcher on the project. I'll introduce Noel in a moment, but also three distinguished panelists as well, whom I'll introduce in a moment also. But we're also delighted to have everybody online as well. Our Legumes for Development project is a project that is funded by the European Union DeSIRA initiative, and is focused on 4 countries, Malawi, Zambia, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. And really the goal of our project is to conduct research and innovation activities that can enable scaling of legumes for smallholders in those 4 countries. My name is Professor Charlie Spillane. I'm from the University of Galway in Ireland, and I'm the project leader for the project. Our project is in partnership with 3 of the CGIAR centres, IITA, ILRI, and CIMMYT, but also with 3 other universities in Europe, SLU in Sweden, Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and also Hohenheim University. So you're all very welcome, and it's really great to see so many people online, and we're delighted to have representation as well from the 4 partner countries. How we're going to run today's webinar is, firstly, we'll have a presentation by Noel, then we'll move to a panel, some Q&A with the panel. I'll ask some questions to the panelists, and then we're going to have Q&A from the audience, and that will be run from the chat function. So we'll be asking you to put your questions or comments in the chat. You can also introduce yourself in the chat if you wish. We should say that this webinar is being recorded and will be pushed up on YouTube. So just to be aware of that, I think for everybody, it's useful to know. And then following the questions and answer session, we're going to also have an interactive exercise or 2 with the online audience, and where we wish to get your inputs as well. So in a nutshell, what we're trying to do here in this webinar is really get the guidance, the inputs, and the wisdom of everybody that's involved in legume seed systems or seed systems in general, particularly focused on smallholders in the region, and to try and collect that knowledge. And we will synthesize that in a report of the webinar and recirculate that back to everybody who is registered, along with the video of this webinar. So at that, I think I'm going to hand over to Noel to give his presentation on some work he's been doing within the project on legume seed systems. So over to you, Noel.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Charlie. And a warm welcome to everyone that is joining us today. So in this presentation, I'm going to walk you through some of the key takeaways from our recent review paper. We've been digging deep into legume seed systems in sub-Saharan Africa, mainly focusing on the challenges, the potential, and how we can scale up these systems. And over the next few slides, I'll show you why this work is important right now, how we put up this paper together, and some of the key findings we uncovered along the way. But before we get started, I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Caitlin Breen, Peter McGuire, and Charlie Spillane. With that said, let's dive right in. Next slide. All right, so just to get a picture of how legume seed systems actually work across sub-Saharan Africa. In this region, smallholder farmers get their seeds from 2 main sources, which is the informal system and the formal systems. Think of them working or running side by side. And even though there's been a push to open up markets, the formal side has been slow to develop, especially for what we call open pollinated varieties. These open pollinated varieties are important because smallholder farmers can save and reuse the seeds for several seasons once they get their hands on them. And that brings us to a really important issue that we'll be discussing today on how to improve access to seed among smallholder farmers, particularly certified or improved legume seed. So here's the thing about formal seed systems. They are designed to get farmers the best seeds, but they only work if those seeds arrive at the right time and in the right amounts. And when these systems are running smoothly, farmers get exactly what they need and when they need it. Now, here's the problem. For legumes, the formal seed systems are often lagging behind. That means in many places, farmers just can't get those improved seeds when they need them. And that is one of the reasons why they rely more on the informal systems. Now, surveys across multiple countries in sub-Saharan Africa showed that over 80% of the legume seeds are sourced from the informal sector, mostly coming from the local markets. And when we look at data from East Africa, for example, what I've tried to show here in figure 1, we see some clear patterns. First, in Ethiopia, most smallholder farmers use non-certified seeds, especially for common beans and faba beans. Wheat, on the other hand, sees a bit more certified seed at 47%. And then in Kenya, there's a big difference between cereals and legumes. We have seen that 78% of the maize seed is certified, and we've seen low values of certified use in legumes. When we cross over to Tanzania, most of the pigeon pea seeds used are non-certified, though 34% do come from the formal sources. So what this tells us is that the formal seed systems in sub-Saharan Africa are more established for cereals like maize and wheat, but legume seed systems are still mostly informal, and there are a few reasons for this. First, there's been less private sector involvement or investment in legume seeds compared to cereals, partly because the market is more fragmented, and also factors like farm size, how much money farmers have, and access to markets, and also their social networks all play a role in whether they choose certified or non-certified seed. And this brings up some important questions, like how can we make informal systems stronger while improving seed quality? And what role do policies and investments need to play to bridge this gap? And to try and answer some of these questions, we did a systematic review that focused on tropical legumes that are currently being produced in sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide. So we followed a pre-planned protocol and PRISMA guidelines in identifying relevant articles, which I will now walk you through using the flowchart here. So we looked in 5 major academic databases, mainly Web of Science, Science Direct, PubMed, ProQuest, and Google Scholar. And we were focusing on studies that were published between 2002 and 2022. And to retrieve these studies, we used specific keywords and Boolean operators. And that helped us to narrow down our results. And within each database, we did 3 separate searches. First, we looked for research that only focused on legume seeds in sub-Saharan Africa. And then we focused on studies that looked at legume seed systems and policies. And finally, we also tried to document studies that looked at options and barriers to scaling legume seed systems. And as you can see from the flowchart, we got a huge number of results at first. So we started by removing any duplicates in EndNote. And then we screened those results based on their titles and abstracts, getting rid of any that were not relevant. And this left us with a smaller set of records to examine more closely. Next, we did full-time text screening. And here we excluded studies that were outside our geographic scope and also studies that were outside our time frame. And after that, we extracted the relevant data from the remaining articles and we organized that in tables. And we used the Joanna Briggs Institute C critical appraisal to kind of control and also check the quality of the data. And after this multi-step process, we ultimately arrived at 129 articles. And these articles formed the core data set for our review. And they are what we will be basing our discussion on today. Next slide. So from our study, it became clear that legume seed systems in sub-Saharan Africa operate through both formal and informal channels. And this schematic provides an overview of the key stakeholders, components, and also processes within these systems, and highlights their interactions and also potential for greater integration. So what jumps out immediately is that most legume seed from the informal comes from the informal system. And so here we are saying most farmers are using their own seed, they're trading with the neighbors, or they're buying certified seed from local markets, or getting seeds from community seed banks. They are not typically relying on established commercial markets. But that doesn't mean the formal system is not important. It still plays a crucial role in breeding new varieties and in ensuring quality control and in certifying seeds. However, it's clear from the literature that we reviewed that the reach of the formal system is limited. And a lot of farmers either can't access certified seed or don't see the need for it. So who are the key players here in these two systems? In the formal system, you've got government agencies, you have research institutions that handle breeding and certification. You also have seed companies and extension service providers that produce, distribute, and provide information to farmers. You also have seed regulatory authorities that make sure that everything meets quality standards. On the other hand, the informal system is driven by farmers themselves. They are the ones that are serving, they are the ones that are exchanging and replanting seeds every season. You also have community seed banks and seed cooperatives that help preserve the traditional varieties, working hand in hand with smallholder farmers. And also we have local markets and social networks, and that's where most of the farmers get their seeds. Now, it's interesting to know that there are some actors like agro dealers, we have traders, and some farmer organizations that bridge both systems. They're kind of connectors that facilitate seed access and also knowledge exchange. And this leads us to a key question that we were also interested in knowing answers for, which is how can we better integrate these two systems? Could we bring in some of the quality assurance practices from the formal system into the informal networks? And could farmer-led seed selection help guide formal breeding programs? Next slide. All right, so this figure here gives us a snapshot of where farmers in sub-Saharan Africa get their legume and cereal seeds. This was drawn from over 10,000 farming households. And what immediately jumps out is the stark contrast between legumes and cereals. For legumes like groundnut and cowpea, the informal system really dominates. In Malawi, for example, over 75% of groundnut and soybean seed comes from the informal sector. It is a similar story in countries like Democratic Republic of Congo, in Kenya, and in Zimbabwe, where the local markets and farmer-saved seed are the primary sources of legume seed. Now, this heavy reliance on the informal system is not necessarily a bad thing. It shows how resourceful farmers are and how they've built these robust networks for sharing and exchanging seeds. But it also highlights some potential challenges. For example, we have seed quality issues in the informal system, and also access can be unequal in the informal system, especially for marginalized groups. But when we look at cereals, especially maize and wheat, we see a different picture. While the informal system is still important, there is a much bigger role for the formal sector. In Zimbabwe, for example, nearly 81% of maize seed is coming from established markets or the formal system. And across countries, the formal sector plays a significant role in maize seed, much more so than for any other legumes. So some people may be interested in knowing why there is a difference between the role formal system is playing in legumes and that of cereals. So there could be several things. For legumes, maybe they just not as much, we don't have as much formally produced seed available, or maybe farmers prefer locally adapted varieties that they can serve and share. And for cereals, particularly maize, they might be a stronger seed system, or maybe there is better access to improved varieties or greater investment in seed production. But what does research say? Previous research studies tell us that limited access to improved varieties coming from the formal system is the major reason why farmers rely so heavily on the informal sector. And this really makes you think, are farmers choosing informal sources simply because they prefer them, or is it because they don't have good access to formal options? And it's a question we need to explore further. And we also want to get answers for questions like, if we had equal access to both formal and informal seed systems, which one would the smallholder farmers choose? And would they stick with the informal networks they know and trust, or would they switch to the formal system if they have access? So as we move forward, the question isn't just about which system is better, it's about how we can make them work together more effectively and how we can strengthen connections between them and ensure access to a diverse range of high quality seed, regardless of where it's coming from, whether it's formal or informal systems. Next slide. All right, so now let's get into what really matters to farmers when they are choosing legume varieties. This slide, along with the graph, gives us some interesting insights. from our review. The big takeaway here is it's not all about yield. Yes, yield is a high priority trade, but farmers are looking at a whole wide range of trades. They are thinking about trades like stress tolerance. They're thinking about pest resistance. They're also considering taste and other culinary qualities. They're also looking at how much labor is involved in producing that crop. And farmers are also paying attention to early maturity, disease resistance, drought and heat tolerance, and even nutritional values. So these factors can be just as important, especially in places where climate change and insect pests are major concerns. So now here is where things get even more interesting. We also found in our review that gender plays a role in trade preferences. We know that male and females value high yield, but there are some key differences in other traits that they are interested in. Studies show that male farmers often lean towards market-driven choices, thinking about affordability, accessibility, and profitability. And meanwhile, female farmers tend to favor land races or traditional varieties that might require less labor. And it could be that land races have specific traits that appeal to female farmers, or it could simply be a matter of familiarity and ease of cultivation. So what does this all mean? Basically, if you want farmers in sub-Saharan Africa to adopt improved varieties, the new improved varieties must tick more than one box. They need to align with real farmer priorities, and also those priorities should include the gender-specific needs that shape their choices in selecting new varieties. Next slide. All right, so let's now look into some of the roadblocks that are slowing down the adoption of improved legume varieties. So here we have a heat map that gives us a clear picture of the key constraints we found in our review. The big takeaway is it's not just one factor holding us back. It's a combination of factors like seed access and those unexpected shocks that can throw everything off balance. Now, if you look at the heat map, you see a bunch of factors listed along the bottom line and the different legume crops along the left side. And those red squares show us where the research we looked at identified a specific factor as limiting the adoption of a particular crop. So for example, you can see the lack of timely access to improved seed is a major problem across many of the legumes. And then there are those external shocks like extreme weather events, like drought, heat stress, and also health shocks like the COVID-19 pandemic was also reported in a lot of studies. And these can affect seed production, seed supply, and also seed trade. But that's not all. We also found that high seed cost, poor quality seed that comes from the informal sources, and lack of investment in breeding new legume varieties are major factors that are slowing down the adoption of new varieties. Next slide. Yeah, so we have talked about the challenges, but now let's focus on the good stuff, the positive impacts of adopting improved legume seeds. So this slide and the graph highlight the key benefits we found in our review. And as you can see, the graph shows how much things changed for farmers who adopted improved legume varieties compared to those who didn't. One of the biggest wins is in consumption. So studies have shown a more than 45% increase in consumption per adult equivalent among improved legume adopters. And here we are referring to studies that were done in Tanzania and Ethiopia, where we saw a big jumps in consumption of groundnuts, pigeon pea, and chickpea. Studies have also shown that adopters saw their household income increase by an average of 27%. And specific studies in Nigeria, Malawi, and Ethiopia found increases in household income ranging from 17% to 38% for legume crops like cowpea, soybean, chickpea, and pigeon pea. Now, studies in Malawi showed an average soybean yield increase of 26% among adopters, and in Ghana, over half of the farmers producing certified groundnut seed had a best benefit cost ratio greater than 1, meaning they were making more money. And the benefits don't end there. In Rwanda, a lot of studies have shown improvements in household dietary diversity and food security among adopters. Next slide. Yeah, so we have talked about the benefits of adopting improved legume seed. But now let's get real about the hurdles we need to clear to get those seeds into more farmers' hands. And here we used this Sankey diagram, which lays out the barriers we identified in our review. And there are a lot of intertwined factors at play. Think of this diagram as a map. On the left, each colored bar represents a specific challenge or a roadblock on the path to scaling up legume production. The lines flowing from these roadblocks show us which crops are most affected by each one. It helps us see the connections between these different challenges and which crops are getting hit the hardest. So what are the major roadblocks we need to address? Number one, we have got restrictive seed policies, and these policies can seriously disrupt the legume seed trade. And this isn't just a minor inconvenience. It affects a whole range of crops, making it harder to get the seeds to the farmers who need them. So we need to rethink these policies and make sure that they are supporting, not hindering, the flow of legume seeds. Next, we have got the lack of improved varieties and the high cost of certified seeds. So we know that without a good supply of affordable, high-quality seeds, farmers are stuck with older varieties, and they may not, and the varieties that they are stuck with, they may not be productive or resilient. Another critical challenge is the lack of access to credit and extension services. We know that without access to credit, farmers can't afford to invest in new seeds and technologies. And without extension services, they lack the knowledge and support to use them effectively. And there's always that ever-present threat of insect pests and diseases, which are a constant headache to seed production systems. In sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of reports of poor soil quality, which is another obstacle. This mainly affects the performance of some varieties, making it harder for smallholder farmers to adopt them. We also found a whole host of other challenges like limited access to essential farming supplies, and even social and cultural issues that can hinder adoption. Another key factor was anti-nutritional factors like aflatoxins in groundnuts, or DAP in grass pea, which can limit the use and adoption of certain legume varieties. Now, all these barriers mainly affect production, but they also have a ripple effect on seed and grain demand. Next slide. All right, so we've seen the challenges, but now let's talk about the proposed solutions. So in this slide, the diagram show the key strategies for scaling up legumes seed systems in sub-Saharan Africa based on what we found in our review. On the left, we've got different strategies, and the lines show which crops they could help the most. It's all about finding the right approach for the right legume crop. So what is the big takeaway here? Basically, there is no one-size-fits-all answer. We need a mix of strategies to make sure our seed systems work well together. And importantly, we need to tailor these strategies to each specific legume crop or region. So first up, let's talk about getting farmers involved in the research or breeding process. We have seen that there is evidence in the published literature that when we involve smallholder farmers in the breeding program or in selecting new improved varieties, they are more likely to adopt them. Another important strategy is giving a boost to new seed businesses. This can be through finance, this can be through training in production, in marketing, in processing, in storage, and other essential skills. We also need to strengthen community seed banks, which are the main source of seed in some communities, especially for orphan and underutilized legumes. We also need more training for breeders, scientists, seed processors, and everyone that is working in the seed industry. And we also need testing of improved varieties in specific locations. This was highlighted as important for groundnuts. And also for common bean, it's all about making the formal and informal seed systems work better together. For soybean, it's about increasing market participation by smallholders. Next slide. Yeah, so none of this work would be possible without the support of the European Union's DeSIRA initiative. And big thanks to everyone listed here for their contributions to this work. Next slide. Thank you. Over to you, Charlie.
Thanks very much, Noel, for great presentation, and it's really it really shows the importance of synthesis of research evidence from the primary research literature. So like we'd like to firstly thank you, Noel, for that great presentation. But we'd also like to thank the online audience for posting questions to the chat. Like it's quite likely that we have a lot of people with expertise in legumes, food security, agriculture, seed systems in the audience and in the online audience. And we'd like to welcome you to post your comments and suggestions and thoughts in the online chat so that you make a contribution as well to the webinar. So please keep doing that as we move along. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to introduce our three panelists. But before I do that, I should also introduce Noel. Noel is one of our talented PhD researchers on the LEG4DEV project here at the University of Galway, and he works on agronomy, crop improvement, and seed systems work packages of the project. Noel has a degree from the University of Zimbabwe and a master's degree in climate change, agriculture, and food security from our university here. Within the project, Noel is collaborating with CIMMYT on crop breeding and genomics of maize-based crop systems, and he's also been working with FAO's regional office in Europe and Central Asia. So just in a sense, we're very delighted to have Noel on our project. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to introducing our three invited panelists, all of whom have had excellent contributions and outstanding contributions to the whole kind of topic of kind of seed systems in the context of food security. I'll introduce the bios of everybody in turn, and then we'll work through some kind of questions for the panelists. Okay, so firstly we have Dr. Chris Ojiewo, and Chris is the partnerships and seed systems lead for dryland crops at CIMMYT. He's also leading Inclusive Delivery, which is the successor of the Seed Equal initiative. He chairs the African Seed and Biotechnology Partnership Platform Steering Committee, and is also the Africa representative at International Seed Science Society. Previously, Chris used to work in ICRISAT as a principal scientist, and he was a cluster lead for the seed systems for dryland crops and grain legumes, which won the prestigious African Food Prize in 2021. Chris, he's published over 100 scientific papers on many topics from crop science to agriculture to seed systems, horticulture and food and nutrition. He has a PhD and an MSc in plant breeding from Ojiewo University in Japan, and also a degree in horticulture from Nairobi in Kenya. So firstly, very much welcome. Very happy to have you here today, Chris, and bring your kind of expertise on this specific topic. I'll next introduce our next panelist, Louise Sperling. I've known Louise for many years, and so Louise has been working in seed systems pretty much throughout her entire career, as far as I can work out. And she's currently the research director of Seed Systems LLC, and coordinates a website that we'd really encourage everybody to look at called seedsystem.org, which shares practical and policy advice to support smallholders in crisis, chronic stress, and developmental periods. That the website brings together or unites seed security specialists in over 100 countries. And Louise's work in recent years, really, she's looking at what you might call normal smallholder farmer systems, but as well smallholder farmer systems that are under stress. And she's led a whole range of seed security missions, including after the Rwandan genocide, post-earthquake Haiti, pre-referendum South Sudan, in northwestern Syria, and more recently in 2024 in Kasai and in DRC. Her current work focuses on promoting effective seed security work in conflict zones and fragile states across about over 40 countries across East, West, and Southern Africa. So again, Louise, it's really great to have you here to bring your perspectives to bear on the topic of this webinar. And last but not least, we have Dr. Shawn McGuire. Shawn has also been working in seed systems throughout most of his career. He's an agricultural officer in the FAO in Rome, and he's the lead within the FAO on seed security. And that includes FAO's responses, emergency responses, and longer-term resilience building activities involving seeds or planting materials to over 60 countries each year. He is also involved in the promotion of seed security assessments to generate evidence to guide these activities. And before he joined FAO, he was a senior lecturer in natural resources at the School of Development Studies in the University of East Anglia in the UK. So welcome to you as well, Shawn. So I'm really delighted to have our three panelists. And what we're going to do before we go to questions from the online audience, we have a series of questions for our panelists. We'll step through those, and then we're going to move to the questions from the online audience, so everybody knows that they're not being ignored, essentially. Okay, so the first question really is a question for Chris. Chris, you've been leading the CGIR's Seed Equal initiative across 10 countries to support delivery of quality seed to farmers, and you currently lead the Inclusive Delivery Programme, which is really seed systems for the overall CG system. What in your mind are the key lessons that have been learned to date regarding particularly legumes, and in particular, what are the key barriers to adoption and use of quality seed of improved legume varieties by smallholders? So with a focus on legumes. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Charlie. Just a quick correction that the CGR seed, Seed Equal was across more than 10 countries. It was 237 countries, if you look at it at a global level, because it has Africa, Latin America, and Asia. But yeah, let's focus on the experiences from Africa. And then onto the question around what seems to be challenges or barriers to adoption of legumes, first at varieties, and secondly at quality seed level. The observations we made, and some of which are reported, some are still data that are currently being analyzed, and some are published. First, a key thing for purposes of adoption is the value proposition that a variety brings, and that is many times breeders develop varieties and are very much satisfied that the varieties are very good as far as they're concerned, and they could have several strong agronomic traits, including resistances and tolerances to diseases, pests, and environmental conditions, etc. But not necessarily they all at every time meeting the interests of the market. And the market is fairly a broad definition here, because the many stakeholders doesn't begin and stop with the farmers. It goes beyond farmers to traders, to processors, to consumers, etc. And as a matter of fact, the word market is not easy to unpack for breeders. And many times the socioeconomists feedback to breeders and say, one of the traits that we'd like to get, developed is marketability. And it just doesn't fit in terms of a trait to develop and integrate into a variety, because there's no specific trait we call marketability. So you have to unpack that word marketability into a language that then fits into what the breeders can be able to package into varieties as they develop market segments that address and develop products that address specific market segments. Another quick point I'd like to bring here is the issue of data. Many times the process of variety release is the data required for variety release at various countries is not a lot in terms of what would really be a strong point for commercialization decisions at taking a risky process of replacing an old variety or replacing a crop with a legume, because they need very strong data then to justify that commercialization decision that a private sector or any other person would get involved into. And the third point I'd like to bring here is the level of awareness. And many times most of the legumes are open pollinated, and being open pollinated, they're also not necessarily very well protected. So a process of licensing that enables the private sector involvement, and that when they invest in awareness creation, they know that they have these varieties under their purview for a duration of time, say 5 years, before others can get into the market and compete with them. So partly that's a challenge that the private sector gives us feedback that, if we invest in promoting this variety, what's the value in it for me? And the public sector as well maybe finds a challenge investing in that sort of promotion. Maybe one or two last points. The supply demand, I would say misalignment. Sometimes there's a lot of demand on the side of demand as far as they view it, but the supply end says, well, sorry, we don't see demand in these crops. So if the demand side says we're looking for these quantities of grain, which should be what drives the seed, then the seed system supply end seems not to be necessarily always ready to meet that demand on time, at a price, or at a cost that is acceptable. And the last point I'd like to bring, particularly in terms of improved varieties, is also some socio-cultural and economic issues, because sometimes you find varieties that are brought down from generation to generation by parents, by great-grandparents, etc. And there could be those local varieties. There could be what we would call land races, but they have very strong connotation in terms of the tie between the generations that come from. So even if you bring up a super variety, a better variety that would replace this with traits that you would consider very important, but because, as an example, this variety came from my mother and it reminds me of my late mother, I'll just not let go of this variety. So sometimes there is an issue of strong holding on to all varieties because of those socio-cultural issues. I beg to stop it here for the sake of time and allow others to also comment. Thank you.
Chris, thank you so much for all those insights, and it's really great to get your insights given the wealth of kind of expertise and experience you've had across the many countries on the CG's kind of seed systems initiative. So that's really wonderful. I'm going to move to Louise next and ask Louise a question, which is really, it's a short question, but there's probably a lot in the question, if you know what I mean. So basically, Louise, you know, you've been working in seed systems for many years. So what do you think needs to change to reach the smallholder farmers who most need quality legume seeds? So, you know, prioritization almost.
Okay, so first I'd like to give admiration to Noel and your full team for the presentation. It was excellent. Really, job well done. Okay, I think the major thing is that the smallholder farmer has to become the customer. So not the NGO, not the university, not FAO, not institutional buyers like the CG. You have to consider, and we have to consider, the small farmers, the one we want to reach. And this is a huge change, not a small change. Let me give 4 quick examples, very quick. It means we have to build on the systems that farmers actually use. And Noel mentioned integration. What does integration really look like in practice? So not just using the word, but doing it. Again, it's a radical change, and I'm just going to talk about delivery. Delivery to the middle of nowhere, to the poor farmer. 4 practical examples. 1, license the kiosks. You know, the place where farmers get sugar, tobacco, maize meal. Farmers go there, sell seed. 2, local markets. Noel, your team mentioned local markets. Sell new varieties systematically in local markets. You know, it could be certified seed, not the agro dealer store, not the seed company. Penetrate the local markets. 3, traders. You know, traders, these are the big guys who go in war zones. These are the people who go in the middle of drought on terrible roads. Enable traders to sell, not give free, high quality seed. And then number 4, we have to create farmer-centered information systems, geo-referenced. Where can farmers get new variety? Where can farmers get high quality seed? And the 2 are different. So I think we should stop mentioning integration and actually practice it. And this is a very big political, legal, and practical shift. That's it.
Louise, thank you so much for those well put points. Yeah, and really, I guess the entire arena we all work in can be very prone to rhetoric versus the reality of smallholders, but also even the rhetoric of putting farmers first. What does that actually mean? Yeah. And so again, you know, and that there's decades of that form of rhetoric, but then turning that into reality can only be experienced by those who are the farmers themselves, I guess.
But Charlie,
thank you for that.
I think we could have impact fast if we're willing to practically change. These are not pie in the sky ideas.
Yeah.
Impact fast.
Okay, so that's the message. Impact fast. Okay, that's good. I'm going to go to Shawn next. Thank you, Louise. Okay, so Shawn, the question here really is, so, you know, the formal sector systems for varietal development, release, and supply, they're often juxtaposed against the informal seed systems, particularly when we talk about legume crops or smallholders. And so, like, I'd like to hear your perspectives on how distinct are the formal and informal sectors. Like, is it the case that the informal sector is simply the absence of the rules and the institutions of the formal sector? And then what opportunities you might see for improving seed supply through both systems? And again, it kind of speaks to the integration, but we could also weave in the impact fast imperative that Louise has pointed to. So over to you, Shawn.
Thank you, Charlie, and thanks, Noel, for an excellent presentation. I'll try to follow Louise's and Chris's examples by being fairly brief on this, because it's a big question. From a farmer's perspective, formal and informal, these distinctions are not always that sharply drawn. Most farmers in most places in the world will use some kind of mixture of formal and informal. Except for the very, very most commercial farmers, even those ones will exchange seeds with friends or other things. Farmers use a mix. So that distinction, you could say, is really where do farmers get seed and under what circumstances? When do they buy? Why do they buy, for example, are perhaps more sharper questions, or what are their needs? So they overlap in practice, and we know that. We know, and Noel's flagged that up, that modern varieties often get circulated, especially for legumes, through informal systems afterwards. So the continuity is quite important. So making a distinction between, is your agenda for impact about getting new varieties to farmers, or is it about seed quality? That entry point might be different. To get a new variety to farmers and having it circulate afterwards through informal systems, we know that that's very common. Climbing beans in Rwanda is a great example of that a good new variety spreads itself. It's then just about seed quality. But you're saying the difference is just an absence of institutions. To a certain extent, they're different, yes, but that they're different institutions or at different scales. So regulation, it's, we won't get into that for breeding or registration or quality assurance, but they're all there operating in varying degrees, with varying degrees of funding in countries. And there's lots of different forms of that as well, but in the formal sector, there's not just one single approach. But in Africa, they tend to be fairly similar. In other countries, there's a bit more maybe market orientation or self-regulation in seed regulation in some aspects of that. And, but farmers have their own institutions as well. Not for every transaction in the informal sector, but we know that there are, especially in looking at markets, and informal markets are a very, very important source of seed for legumes, maybe about 50%. Farmers buy, they don't buy from just anyone. So they're people who have reputations, who charge a higher price than for other farmers for grain. There are actions around that. Now, whether those are institutional actions or they're practices, you could say these are good traders, or as Louise was mentioning, the larger traders who move between regions. They're doing things that farmers recognize and are willing to pay 10% more for. That seed is coming from a particular location, it's kept pure, that they can give the provenance, that they have some relationship with that seller, so they have a guarantee or at least some form of accountability later on. So, those are aspects of institutions as well. I think that's more, but I wouldn't overstate that. I think, anthropologists can get in and talk about the cultural links between, networks and social networks and how they shape movement of seed in the informal system. I think that's more around varieties, around how people first get a variety passed to them through kinship networks and so on. All very interesting, but that's not really what we're talking about here. And so from a day-to-day basis, how farmers in sub-Saharan Africa get seeds, they're buying them often, at least half the time. And so then you're looking at those institutions. And finally, you were asking a bit how to kind of strengthen access. Louise has mentioned some of them already around licensing. I would also add to that around improving access, distribution points, to bring points of sale in closer proximity to farmers. So really looking at how we improve access. That's one. Another is saying, well, after first people have access to new varieties or good quality seed, what other activities are in the subsequent generations, whether through local organizations or farmer groups, to continue multiplying seed of good quality? You know, what are ways that a sort of second stage can improve access to make sure that if not everyone has access to certified seed every season, that what they're multiplying for the next 3 or 4 years is good? What sorts of ways that that can be done? You know, community seed banks are talked about for that. There may be not the best mechanism in my view, but there may be other mechanisms for that to kind of link to, say, you've got access to new varieties, but then how do you keep seed quality going? Demonstration plots, you know, just a very basic thing, what Chris was talking about, adoption. How do farmers know about new varieties or know about any variety? And demonstration plots are what the private sector spend half their funds on in the seed sector, are on demonstrations and extension. It's very, very basic work that needs a lot of time and effort, and the public sector doesn't really give that same level of attention. So that's, you know, basic points. Thinking about policy recognition for both formal and informal, and what does that actually mean? I know in Noel's review paper you mentioned a little bit about policy for informal, recognizing informal seed sector. But what does that mean in practice? And, you know, how can that be impactful? So say there may still be scope, for example, in supporting investment in a wider diversity of seed organizations or enterprises, or recognition support for variety release. So again, it's thinking about that practically. And I just put that in as a kind of wider question at the end to pose a challenge. And the final thing I would say is around just supporting end markets. To, you know, this is, in the end, farming is about, people need to have value from farming. They need to make a living from that. And so if we're going to increase demand for seed from whatever source, then it really helps. And I know work in CIMMYT and PABRA, Jean-Claude Rubiogo has written a lot about this and shown and demonstrated the links, not just in rhetoric, but in kind of showing the evidence that having end demand makes a real difference. So that's it. Thanks.
Shawn, thanks so much for all those kind of excellent points, I think, and they're all extremely well made. And I guess it exemplifies both the complexity of the challenge in terms of that there is no silver bullet solution. It's really a systemic kind of issue that is the challenge here. So Chris, I'm going to go over to you next, and so we'll do one more round of questions with our panelists, and then we'll move to the questions from the audience. So Chris, given the barriers that smallholder farmers face to access quality legume seeds, what are some of the innovative approaches that the CGR centres have been employing with partners to improve access to quality legume seed by last mile farmers?
Thank you. Let me pick from the last point. Shawn mentioned and cited the example of Jean-Claude Rubiogo, who has been leading a work package for the Legume Seed Systems for the Seed Equal Initiative, and that brings together several legume crops under his purview, and has led a process or a model we're calling demand-led seed systems, so looking at various actors with the understanding that indeed farmers need quality seed, need higher yielding varieties. But of course, once you increase the yield of the farmers beyond subsistence, then farmers need to sell that. Otherwise, they've no excitement of adopting a higher yielding variety, adopting quality seed and paying more when there is no one paying for it. Somebody needs to pay for that cause that the farmer invested, and divided the work along various actors, looking at first the supply actors, looking at the distribution actors, the suppliers, basically production, seed production, and seed distribution with many actors within there and off-takers, and then looking at the consumption end, and the consumption end here looks at people like processors, who basically doing value addition. So looking at those various actors together in sort of a loop and asking ourselves, now that we understand demand, how do you supply? Otherwise, it goes back to the challenge I was talking about earlier of a mismatch between demand and supply, where sometimes, of course, we've had cases where you go to a center and you find that they've produced more seed than was demanded in a particular year. And that could be early generation seed. We've got such cases where somebody has produced a lot of breeder seed, a lot of foundation seed, but that was not bought. And also there are cases where people have come with demands and tons of seed have been requested for a specific variety that cannot be produced and distributed at that particular time. If you're able to follow that demand-led seed systems approach, then you have a communication and a feedback loop between the supply and demand. The second point I could give as an example is linking between, again, demand and supply. We put people in a room, the demand side and the supply end, and ask them if the demand end says we're looking for these quantities of grain, but you guys from the supply end say that there is no demand. What's the problem? And we realized that the problem was actually quality. And quality here is not specifically germination capacity or anything. Quality here are quality standards of the grain that these people are looking for. And if they say, for example, we are looking for tan variety, small size, and this, they're not going to buy a mixture of tan with red and small and big and all that. So it must be the specific grades and standards they're looking for. Those specific grades and standards cannot be met if the input, which is seed, is already mixed from the beginning. And so we have been putting efforts at creating what we're calling youth and women quality centers, which is basically a community-based seed production, but also grain market linkage approach, which now links the supply end and the demand end, but also works with an understanding of what the quality needs are of the demand side and communicates that feedback to the supply end to ensure that we have the right quantities required. And the last point I'd like to make is from the side, my position as the chair of Africa Seed and Biotechnology Partnership Platform. This last December, we put a lot of efforts at looking at what we're calling farmer managed seed systems. Farmer managed seed systems in terms of developing a policy framework, a strategy framework, and implementation plan, where the process of getting these tied up and then cleaned up in a way that we can socialize them with the higher level policymakers to be able to give them a green light to be shared, and then of course to be localized, socialized to the various countries. And of course, this comes from the realization of the fact that, as of course shared by Noel, a significant amount of seed that feeds particularly Africa is coming from the informal, if you compare the various crops that is shared. But yet there's no policy, there is no strategy around farmer managed seed systems. So we're putting that together, not necessarily to make the process difficult, but to support the process, and particularly to link it up with the formal seed systems so that they have an understanding that these are not competitors, but complementers, and as best as possible to support each other in terms of getting seed to the farmers, and particularly the last mile. And in this last mile approach, there's a model I've been discussing with somebody here. We talked about what we're calling agro dealerships. But most agro dealerships, if you go to a local agro dealer today, in most countries, you will not find, for example, groundnut. It's too bulky, and if it is shelled, you lose viability so quickly. And so groundnut is not available in most of those agro dealer centers. They have to get them from community seed producers. Can you think of something? I'm thinking of something. I'm discussing this with people on what I'm calling in situ agro dealerships. Basically, still linking with the private sector, but linking them to community-based seed producers, not to sell back seed to them, but to produce seed and now sell to the last mile farmers, so that the seed is made available, just like an agro dealer would have sold it to the farmer. But now the community seed producer produces and sells it to the farmer, but still links back. And of course, as Louise put it, it requires a lot of policy change. It requires a lot of political and legal goodwill. Over.
Chris, thanks so much, and it's really great to see that these innovative initiatives being developed by your work and your colleagues in the CG system. So I'm going to move to Louise next. We question for Louise and then a question for Shawn, and then we'll go to questions from our online audience. So Louise, you've been working like a lot with smallholders in fragile kind of contexts over the years, and like resilience as a concept, as a characteristic, is desired within agri-food systems. It's also a desirable property for seed delivery and supply systems. So given that seed systems can be impacted by economic shocks, natural disasters, conflict, what do you think needs to be done to make seed systems more resilient to external shocks, including adverse weather shocks that are likely to be more frequent as a result of climate change, and who should do what to build resilience?
Okay, I am going to be quick because I'm curious to hear from the participants also. When we talk about resilience, and I think Shawn and I first wrote about it 15 years ago, so people have been thinking about it for a while, you have to realize that local systems, informal systems, tend to be very resilient. So, for instance, in the middle of Rwanda genocide and civil war, which was during the growing season, bean seed systems still worked. So when you talk about resilience, think about strategies to support local systems, formal systems, but also their integration. I'm just going to make 3 points again. Promoting resilience is going to take huge political will. In the United States, we had a breakthrough and had that recently where the Department of State launched a program to support what you call orphan crops, and they called opportunity crops. So the government put on the agenda diversity, variety diversity, crop diversity, and a whole sort of programs unfolded. That has been cut, but there was political will and it can happen. Second, I think we have to be realistic about decentralized seed production models. The community-based ones are small scale, usually not sustainable. We need to do real research, and maybe your group, Charlie, comparing different types of decentralized production, their costs, their benefits, their diversity, and be frank. What works, what doesn't? And then third, I want to draw attention to storage because we don't talk about it enough. In conflict, in drought, in low production zones, storage is a strategic investment, right? Whether it be underground pits or hermetic bags, let farmers store what they already have. So let's put it on the research agenda. And that's it. There are an array of actions, but I'm quite critical, for instance, of my CG colleagues. Not Chris, I'm from CIMMYT, but I think the CG, for instance, is too production-oriented, too marketing-oriented, at the expense of resilience. So let's make better choices. Finally, the humanitarian sector in the United States has been given a huge blow. And they were the ones who were forging forward on resilience, right? Who's going to do resilience? The NGOs. I would now like to put the call, the wish to CG, to universities, to governments to take resilience more seriously. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise, and I'm glad that we brought up the topic of resilience here, and you've spoken kind of eloquently on its importance. So I think that's really important, and I think you've made the points very well as to why it really needs to be one of a central issue as we consider seed systems. So I'm just gonna move to Shawn here for a last question in this round, and then we move to the questions from the audience. So again, focusing specifically on legume seed systems, the topics of this webinar, you, Louise, and others, you did an analysis of multiple legume seed transactions by smallholders across, I think, 9 African countries. And what were the key findings of that study, and what implications does the findings of that study do they have for reform of legume seed systems so that they can more effectively benefit smallholders? Were there any kind of take-home messages from them? Shawn?
Okay, thanks. And I'll also try to be really brief because a lot of points have been said already. But for this study itself, one of the key messages was that the most important source for legumes was local markets. About 46% by transaction, probably more than half by volume of seed each year, is where farmers actually get their seed is by purchasing it from the local markets. So that's informal, but channels, but not necessarily informal seed in terms of the variety origin. That's a separate thing. So another 11% was from agri-dealers. So you could say that, you know, the informal sector purchase was 4.5 times bigger than the formal sector. So that's one key point. NGOs were 8% and own seed was about 29%. So what it's saying is the most important year upon year for farmers is they buy their seed, and mostly from the informal sector. So one of the implications is that raises the question, well, why? Why is it, and this is more important for legumes than it is for any other group of crops, than for cereals or for vegetatively propagated crops. Why do they buy seed? One is storage challenges that, as Chris was saying, for groundnuts or other crops, it can be a headache for farmers for, say, cowpeas, to store seed quality at home. They could outsource that to somebody else. The seed is widely available in the local markets, and the quality in local markets is often quite good. That, you know, visually you can see standard varieties, you can see many aspects of quality visually in a market, not all of them, of course. And that farmers will sell legumes as for cash. So all of those reasons in combination are some of the reasons why farmers source a lot of their seed from purchasing. One of the other findings of the study was just asking the question, and we didn't, and this is really something for future research as well, saying, well, why do people buy legume? You know, what are the market segments to really think about as a leverage point for working forward? And you know, the reasons include farmers looking for a new variety, which is a relatively small reason why farmers may be purchasing seed. Much more common may be to replace seed that's lost, or because the reasons I just said, they don't want to store them themselves. And so they're going to the market for those reasons. And finally, it may be because the seed, they're seeking seed of a certain quality for an end user market. So what I was mentioning earlier, that, so for example, in Ethiopia, pea beans or haricot beans, farmers may go to a formal sector source because they can get a premium market for selling those beans later for canning quality, and they have to demonstrate provenance. So those understanding, and I guess my final point in this is just to say, well, what is this? How does this help us? You know, these points we've been talking about, all of us up till now, on saying it has to be much more farmer oriented. For scaling seed systems, we have to look at impact. We have to understand what farmers are already doing and how we can strengthen that. Understanding why farmers are making the choices to buy seed for legumes and when, under what circumstances, is important. And that's an area that we can look at more as part of this larger picture of incentives for adoption, appropriate business models for enterprises at the right scale, and so forth. To say, from our paper that Louise and I and other colleagues did, has just opened up that question. I can't say we have definitive answers. We looked at a bit of illustrative evidence from different places, a bit like Noel's review paper. But to get into detail in a case to say, well, why are farmers here buying groundnuts or not, will be important if you're wanting to set up a groundnut enterprise. So it's taking that kind of framework and saying, well, how does this help us make better plans for all the suggestions we've given up till now? Thanks.
Thanks so much, Shawn, and that's really great. And it's good to get the message from that study. So next we're going to move to a Q&A. There's questions coming in on the chat, which we'll field to Noel and the panelists next. But before we do that, we've an online participatory exercise that we'd like to do with the audience. Two exercises that can be done pretty quickly, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So Harry, if you could share your screen, I can kind of explain this. So basically, if any of you are online with a phone, if you can see the QR code on the left hand side of the screen, if you take an image of that, it will open on your browser, and this question will pop up for you to basically provide one word of what you consider to be the most important topic, intervention, or indeed action to enable scaling of legumes for smallholders in East and Southern Africa. It'll essentially generate a word cloud for us. If you're not on a phone and you're on a computer like I am, then if you can see, if you type in vvox.app into your browser and put in the ID number, it will take you into this piece of software, and then we can provide the word that you think really, having listened to all of the speakers and the panelists, and also your own experience and that of your colleagues, it would be interesting to see what people consider to be the most important topic. And then, Harry, if you move to the next, we have one other exercise we want to try and get from the audience. So we have one more to show you. It's essentially a prioritization. So it's a list of priority research topics that could be considered, and we'd like to hear from the audience as to what you considered would be the most important research topic that would enable scaling of legumes, down to what you think would be the least important of 8 options. Okay, so if you go into that vvox app through either your phone, using the QR code, or then you can provide your input, and again this would generate some feedback for us that would be quite valuable to the project. And as we said, somebody asked in the question, would we document all of the inputs and the perspectives and experience of the panelists? And the answer is yes, we will put all of this together in a report and return it to everybody who's an attendee registered for the webinar. So I'm going to go next to the questions, because I'm aware we're running a little bit over time. So I'm going to begin with a question for Noel. So Tamirat asks the question in the chat. And Tamirat is asking the question about the crop characteristics of, like, the biological characteristics of legumes. And so is the reason for farmers' reliance on formal versus informal systems for legumes versus maize also due to the crop characteristics? Like, does that have a bearing on the difference between a maize system, a maize crop versus, any of the legumes? And the legumes may differ within.
Yeah, there are some studies that are reporting on that, and in our review, we found that farmers really look at the plant characteristics when they are selecting a variety that they to adopt, and those characteristics also vary when you ask female farmers and male farmers. But it also based on where the farmer is located. In some regions that are maybe experiencing a lot of extreme weather events, they are most likely going to adopt varieties that do well under stress. Or maybe they'll just end up sticking with the locally adopted varieties. But in areas that are receiving better, maybe, weather conditions, the farmers in those regions are most likely at a position to adopt varieties that are different, and they are more welcoming, and they are willing to test a number of varieties. So it all depends with what conditions the farmer is producing in. And there are other factors also, like markets. In some instances, you see that a bean or trader may be interested in a specific trait or a certain type of bean variety. The farmers in that region may be forced to just adopt a variety that the trader wants to buy from them. So those are some of the factors to consider when they are selecting a variety or a system to use in accessing seed.
Thanks so much, Noel. And I'm just going to pass another question, I think, to Chris. This is a question that came in from Paul. It's actually 2 questions, but so Paul is asking a question. Has failure to access certified seed by farmers in the formal seed system affected the yield potential of legumes in sub-Saharan Africa? So I suppose it's the yield gain from certified seeds. And then the second question is about the price of certified seed in the informal sector. Seems to be cheaper than the formal sector. Do you think that could be a motivation factor for farmers to go for uncertified seed? It's the price differential. So I'm going to pass that to Chris, if Chris is there.
I'll start with the second question.
Yeah.
Definitely price is an issue. The cost of seed is an issue to farmers. If they can be able to access, let me call it planting material, because sometimes some of them do not necessarily fit into the definition of seed by the standards of the countries. If you purchase a grain and plant, the countries don't define them as seed, but by definition, otherwise, seed and grain are actually 2 peas in the same pod, only handled slightly differently. But I would say that said, if you look at some of the traits in terms of basic traits around germination, etc. Sometimes you find that they're pretty much similar, and the farmers can be able to essentially not see a significant difference in terms of why they would invest in a slightly more expensive source of seed or source of planting material if they can get it cheaply elsewhere. Many times this is because of subsistence and because of the value chain after that. The farmer is also pretty much informal. So if it's a farmer who buys this and uses for her own household or sells in, again, an informal market, definitely that farmer is not overly motivated to purchase higher quality seed or at a more expensive price. But if you're dealing with a farmer who has, say, for example, contractual agreement with an aggregator or off-taker who is exporting, who is processing, who is making peanut butter, for example, that farmer would be probably a little more careful in terms of the linkages that they have with the off-taker. And many off-takers have now put farmers in some sort of contractual agreements where they produce seed and sell back to farmers, and some of them actually recycle. Off-takers also do end up recycling. But of course, sometimes if you look at what they give back to the farmers, it's fairly high quality. Some of the risks around there would be things like potentially, plowing back a lot of seedborne diseases, and of course the genetic impurity that I mentioned earlier would be something that would discourage off-takers from getting involved. But of course, understandably, farmers would want to get the cheapest possible source at the cheapest cost, and of course with best returns. On the issue of whether higher or certified seed necessarily return higher yields, it's a mixed bag here. One, if you're using certified seed of a very old variety with a low genetic potential, you will not necessarily significantly change a lot in terms of getting higher yields. So it must be a mixed approach. From first, the variety must be higher yielding and the seed quality must be high enough. And of course, that also means that if you start with poor quality seed, even if it is of a better variety in terms of potential yield, you're also likely not to get the best potential out of it. Sometimes it's also because of your poor germination that may end up having a germination of 50%, 60%, 70%, if it is not really gone through the official certification and validated to be the right quality. So overall, I would say two things have to be put together: the genetics of the variety, but also quality seed overall. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. And so I'm going to pass perhaps kind of two related questions to Louise, right? So Cisse and Tajuddin had two questions that are somewhat related. So Cisse made the point that the limited improved varieties of legumes, they're not easily accessible to smallholders, and that most of the research remains on the shelf. Okay, that's one point. And then Tajuddin indicated that specifically in Ethiopia, there's a lack of distributors, despite there being many opportunities for choosing legume varieties. There's quite a lot of seed in it, so it may differ between countries. But like, I guess from your perspective, Louise, is when we look specifically at legumes, is there a lot of legume innovation, if you want, on the shelf that farmers lack access to, that smallholders lack access to, and what potentially can be done to move things off the shelf if they're there?
So if I understand the question, are there wonderful varieties on the shelf
exactly
that need to be moved?
Mm-hmm.
That differs a lot by country. I know in Ethiopia, when we did a study, 90% of the new varieties had not been moved. Mm-hmm. So only 10% had been moved. We can't say whether they're good or bad because farmers didn't have access to them. But the colleague is raising a good issue that there are a lot of research products that have never been moved. On the second question on distribution, I think we've all talked about this in this exchange, that there are many things that could be done positively, whether it's traders or Chris's in situ shops. Many opportunities. I think the biggest opportunity is that legume seed is bought. So Shawn was saying that 50% of legume seed is bought. It happens to be in local markets, but that is a huge asset to capture that people are willing to buy, get the marketing points there, and as Chris said, get a good price for product. But this is a dynamic market that's waiting to be served.
Thanks, Louise. And so I'm going to ask one more question here to Shawn before we look at the results of the online polling, put it that way. So Shawn, this is kind of a broader question, I guess, that we're all aware of, is that of climate change and the climate crisis. And like, Shawn, what are your kind of thoughts on how climate change will intersect with seed systems, and what needs to be done to ensure that seed systems can they can adapt to climate change impacts, essentially? Just any kind of thoughts?
Okay. A few things. I mean, one is obviously on the variety selection and what kind of forecasting can be done. And, that's back to breeding and research, of course. And so there, the CGR is leading on that, but national systems should be stepping up as well, in universities to help think through. But that's just on traits. Another aspect is on resilience and saying, well, it's not going to be more stress, but more unpredictability as well. So where do legumes fit into cropping systems that may be more robust? What are fallback cropping systems? And I think of this paper from, crikey, 30 years ago from Sam Fujisaka in Ethiopia, that was looking at farmer plans, and farmers had about 8 different fallback positions. If the rains fail at this point, they drop maize and shift to wheat. If it goes bad, then they go to teff. If that goes bad, they go to chickpea, and so on, depending on soil type. And but my point here is that people have a plan B, a plan C, and so forth, given the patterns of rainfall and other stresses that happen. That may be more of a feature. So we're back to points like, I think it was Chris was mentioning information, or everyone was, knowing where you can get seed, which varieties, which crops, who supplies that? Is that near? Is that far away? So that may be linking to local enterprises. And this is a challenge for what Chris is saying about in situ agro-dealers, which is fantastic. But then if that, how might that work across scales? Maybe that can't. Maybe that will for other crops. But it's thinking about that, when you've got a disaster, where do you go to get quality chickpea seeds when you have residual rainfall? Those are just a few of the entry points. I know there's many, many more, but they're just keeping it practical and brief. That I think that flexibility and information and planning ahead will really help. Thanks.
They're really wonderful points, Shawn, and well articulated. And I guess, it speaks to the need to that everybody needs to be planning for the future as well. But farmers live in the present also. So there are kind of two timelines to be considered here. So we're getting close to the end here, and so Harry has put up the word cloud that was generated by the online audience, and like one thing that kind of stands out here, I think, is that markets are very much to the fore as being prominent in people's minds in relation to being critical for enabling scaling of legumes for smallholders. So that's one point. And then access is also another word that has really popped up here, and as being one of the kind of pillars of food security, one might expect that. But there's a whole range of other points being made, I think, in this word cloud that are all relevant. So it's not just one thing, but some things are more to the fore than others. And if Harry could put up the other screen for the prioritization exercise, we could just see what the outcome of that was. And again, this was really where Noel and ourselves had listed a range of research topics that could be considered critical for advancing legume seed systems in Eastern Southern Africa, and then which of these did the audience consider would be most important or highest priority. And clearly, farmer adoption and preferences came out on top. Breeding legumes for climate resilience next, market and value chain development, seed quality certification. So clearly they're all important because there are votes for every one of these. So again, I guess it speaks to the need for a kind of systemic approach to by all of the actors within the the legume seed system to enable scaling for smallholders. And it comes back to the points I think well made by Louise, that there's a political will, a need for financing, a need for institutions working together, and so forth. So like I think at that I think we should wrap up because I think we've had some really excellent and detailed conversation and inputs from Noel for his great presentation, which was really well presented and really set the scene for the conversation. And then our panelists who have all like years of experience on this topic and really the detailed guidance and inputs that they've provided, but not only our panelists, but also our online participants who've all provided questions and their input within the chat. And so for any of you whose question didn't get asked, we will weave that into the report on this particular webinar. So we're very much interested in inclusion rather than exclusion. So I'd like to thank everybody, thank Noel, our panelists, our online audience. I'd like to thank our funders, the European Union DeSIRA initiative, and wish you all a lovely day. Thank you.